A man, visibly worn out from a grueling day at work, entered a small cafe tucked away from the bustling streets. Seeking solace in its quiet corners, his eyes scanned the room for a seat. Amid the soft clinking of cups and murmured conversations, his gaze fell on a young waitress. She appeared drained, her movements sluggish as she balanced a tray of steaming coffee cups. Her eyes, rimmed red, betrayed the effort it took to hold back tears. The man hesitated for a moment before approaching the counter. He placed his order, a black coffee, and watched her closely as she moved. She stumbled slightly, catching herself on the edge of the counter. Her hand trembled when she handed him his change, and her voice wavered as she mumbled, "Enjoy your coffee." He chose a seat near the window, partly for the view but mostly to observe her discreetly. Something about her struck a chord. She seemed too young to carry such a heavy burden. As she moved between tables, a rude customer at the far end of the cafe called out, snapping his fingers impatiently. "Hey, waitress! Do you think we have all day?" he barked. Her head jerked up, and she hurried over, apologizing profusely. But it wasn't enough. The man shoved his plate forward, spilling crumbs onto her apron. "This toast is cold. Can't you do your job right?" he sneered, his voice carrying across the cafe. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, it looked as though she might say something. But instead, she bit her lip, nodded, and picked up the plate. The humiliation in her eyes was palpable, her cheeks flushed with suppressed anger and shame. The man by the window clenched his fist, considering intervening. Yet, something told him this wasn't an isolated incident. He decided to wait and see how the situation unfolded. Minutes later, the waitress returned with fresh toast, only to be berated again for taking too long. The customer waved her off dismissively, muttering loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Useless." She hurried away, her head bowed, her hands shaking as she gripped the tray. The man couldn't take it anymore. Rising from his seat, he approached the table. "Excuse me," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "You seem to be enjoying your meal, so maybe you could enjoy it a little more quietly?" The rude customer looked up, startled, before sneering. "Mind your own business. She's paid to take care of you, isn't she?" The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a cold, dangerous tone. "And you're paid to what? Sit here and prove you're an entitled jerk." A tense silence fell over the cafe. The waitress froze behind the counter, her wide eyes darting between the two men. The rude customer pushed his chair back, standing up to meet the man's challenge. But the cafe owner intervened before things escalated, firmly escorting the irate customer out. As the door slammed shut behind him, the waitress let out a shaky breath, her hand clutching the counter for support. The man turned to her, softening his tone. "Are you okay?" She hesitated before nodding, her lips forming a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The interaction left a ripple in the cafe. Conversations resumed, but the tension lingered. The man returned to his seat, his coffee now lukewarm. He watched as the waitress tried to compose herself, wiping her eyes discreetly with the edge of her sleeve. A few minutes later, she brought him a fresh cup of coffee, unasked. "On the house," she said softly. He nodded, accepting it with a quiet thank you. It wasn't much, but in that moment, a small connection formed between two strangers, both weary in their own ways, sharing a fleeting moment of understanding in a world often too harsh to notice. The man noticed the waitress's shaky hands and hollow gaze as she cleared a nearby table. He couldn't shake the image of her being berated earlier, the humiliation still fresh in her movements. Deciding to act, he called her over, his voice calm yet insistent. "Excuse me," he said, glancing at her name tag. "Is everything okay, Grace?" Her eyes darted to his face, startled by the unexpected kindness. For a moment, she hesitated, visibly debating whether to dismiss him or speak. Then, as if the weight of her burdens cracked the fragile dam she had built, the words tumbled out. "I'm sorry if I seem distracted," she began, her voice cracking slightly. I've been working 2 shifts a day for weeks now. I have a 2-year-old at home, and I don't think I'm managing." Her words came out haltingly, as though each sentence was a confession she hadn't intended to share. She twisted the edge of her apron in her hands, her fingers trembling. I'm a single mom, and daycare costs. They're insane. I barely see my little girl. I feel like I'm failing her. The man nodded, leaning forward slightly, his tone low and steady. That sounds overwhelming. But you're doing it, you're working, providing for her. That's not failure. Grace smiled weakly, but the weight of her exhaustion still clung to her. Before she could say more, the cafe's door slammed open, and a tall man with a sharp suit strode in. His commanding presence immediately pulled the attention of the room. His face was etched with disdain as his cold gaze swept across the cafe, pausing deliberately on Grace. It was her boss. Grace. He barked, his voice slicing through the cafe's ambient noise like a whip. Can you explain why Table 5 hasn't gotten their drinks yet? Or are you too busy chatting with customers to do your damn job? Her face turned pale, and she stammered out an apology, rushing toward the counter. The man at the table clenched his fists under the table. Watching the scene unfold, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anger, not just for the cruelty of the boss but for the silent spectators who watched but did nothing. The boss followed her to the counter, his voice raised so the entire cafe could hear. This isn't a charity, Grace. If you can't handle the pace, you're free to leave. But maybe you'd rather keep flirting with customers to make up for those lousy tips? Laughter from a table in the back, a group of smug young men who had been watching the drama, only fueled the humiliation. Grace's shoulders hunched further as she prepared the drinks, her hands trembling so violently that she spilled milk across the counter. Unbelievable, the boss sneered. Clean it up and pull yourself together. You're an embarrassment. As she scrambled for a rag, one of the men at the back table, a young, overly confident white man with a cocky grin, decided to add to the humiliation. Hey, maybe she should stick to what she's good at, he said loudly. Bet she's used to cleaning up after her own messes. Isn't that right, sweetheart? Laughter erupted from the table, and Grace's face turned scarlet. Her breathing grew shallow, and tears glistened in her eyes. The man who had spoken to her earlier stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. His tall frame loomed over the table of young men, his eyes dark with anger. Is this funny to you? He asked coldly, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. The ringleader smirked, leaning back in his chair. Just having a little fun, old man. You know, she's probably used to it. Some people just can't handle a bit of good-natured ribbing. Good-natured? The man shot back, his voice rising. Do you even hear yourself? You're mocking a woman who's trying to survive, and for what? To feel better about yourself? The table fell silent, the smirks fading into something closer to irritation and embarrassment. The boss, still standing by the counter, interjected. Sir, if you have an issue with my staff, I suggest you take it elsewhere. We run a professional establishment here. The man turned on him, his voice calm but laced with steel. Professional? Humiliating your employees in front of customers is professional? You should be ashamed. The boss stepped back, flustered but unwilling to concede. If you don't like how I run things, you're welcome to leave. The man smiled coldly. Gladly. But Grace doesn't deserve to be treated like this. Grace, standing frozen at the counter, whispered, It's okay. Please don't. No, the man said firmly, turning back to her. It's not okay. The tension in the cafe was palpable, every eye on the confrontation. The boss sputtered, trying to regain control of the situation. Grace needs this job. You're not helping her by making a scene. Grace's voice, small but steady, broke through the noise. You're right. I do need this job. But that doesn't mean I deserve to be treated like trash. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The man by the counter turned to her, his expression softening. You don't. And if you ever decide to walk out of here, I bet you'll find something better. You're stronger than you think. Tears slid down Grace's cheeks, but she nodded, the smallest flicker of hope sparking in her eyes. The man nodded back, then turned to leave, his coffee forgotten. As he stepped outside, he glanced back through the window, seeing Grace standing a little taller, her chin slightly raised. The cafe wasn't silent, it would never be silent. But for Grace, that small moment of defiance was deafening. As the man prepared to leave, He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket and began to write. His pen moved deliberately, the scratch of ink on paper blending with the low hum of the cafe. Grace, still shaken but now tidying the counter with more purpose, glanced his way but said nothing. He folded the note carefully and placed it under the edge of his coffee cup, making sure it was visible. Before stepping out, he caught her eye one last time, offering her a small nod of encouragement. She smiled faintly, her lips trembling, unsure if she could trust the rare kindness he'd shown her. The cafe door swung shut behind him, but Grace's thoughts lingered on his words. After a moment, she walked over to clear his table and spotted the folded piece of paper. Curiosity outweighed hesitation as she opened it. Her eyes widened as she read the neat handwriting. Grace, you are stronger than you think. Every day you fight for your daughter is a testament to your love and resilience. It's not about perfection, it's about showing up even when it's hard. You may not see it now, but every small effort you make is building a brighter future for her. Don't let anyone make you feel invisible. You matter. Keep going. A stranger. Her breath hitched as she read the words again, the unexpected encouragement hitting her like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. For the first time in weeks, tears slid down her cheeks not from humiliation but from an overwhelming sense of hope. She folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket, gripping it tightly like a talisman. The moment of solace was short-lived. The group of young men, emboldened by the absence of their earlier challenger, resumed their loud, mocking laughter. Their leader leaned back in his chair, speaking just loud enough for Grace to hear. Looks like someone's got a secret admirer. Bet she thinks she's some tragic heroine now, he sneered, the others chuckling along. Grace froze, her hand brushing against the note in her pocket. The warmth it had given her moments ago now felt overshadowed by their cruelty. She gritted her teeth, willing herself to ignore them, and focused on her work. But they weren't done. Hey Grace, the leader called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Why don't you read us the love letter? Or was it just another guy telling you to quit embarrassing yourself? The other men roared with laughter, their amusement at her expense as loud as it was merciless. Grace's hands trembled as she cleared a nearby table. She wanted to scream, to yell at them to stop, but the weight of their taunts pressed down on her like a vice. Behind the counter, her boss glanced over but didn't intervene. Instead, he smirked faintly, as if silently condoning their behavior. Grace's anger flared, but she knew better than to expect support from him. She'd already seen where standing up for herself had gotten her. The humiliation built like a storm, her cheeks burning red as the men's taunts grew louder. Come on, Grace, another one called out. Let's see that note. Bet it's real poetic, huh? Something about how you're the saddest little waitress in town. Their laughter cut through her like shards of glass, each insult sharper than the last. She felt the walls of the cafe closing in, the disapproving stares of the other customers only adding to her shame. Just as she thought she couldn't endure another second, the door opened and the man returned. His eyes swept the room, immediately landing on Grace and the group of young men. He didn't need to ask what was happening. The tension was palpable, the tears in Grace's eyes a silent cry for help. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice firm. The leader of the group smirked, leaning back in his chair. Nothing, old man. We're just having a little fun. Don't tell me you're here to play the knight in shining armor again? The man stepped closer, his posture radiating quiet authority. Fun, he said, his voice low but sharp. You call tormenting someone fun? Let me tell you something. Your idea of entertainment is pathetic. The young man's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. Relax, Grandpa. We're just joking around. She can handle it. Can't you, Grace? The man ignored him, his attention focused solely on Grace. Are you okay? He asked gently. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm fine. But her trembling hands betrayed her words. The leader of the group scoffed. See? She's fine. No harm, no foul. The man turned back to him, his expression hardening. You don't get to decide that. If you've got nothing better to do than tear people down, maybe it's time you found somewhere else to be. The young man stood, his friends shifting uneasily behind him. You don't scare me, he said, though the slight quiver in his voice suggested otherwise. I'm not trying to scare you, the man replied. I'm just telling you to leave. Now, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Finally, the group gathered their things and shuffled out, the leader muttering curses under his breath. As the door closed behind them, the cafe seemed to exhale, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. Grace turned to the man, her voice shaky. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he said simply. No one deserves to be treated that way. She nodded, the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. Instead, she reached into her pocket and touched the note he had left her earlier, its presence grounding her. Before he could leave again, she whispered, "Thank you. For everything." He smiled faintly, nodding once before stepping out into the evening. Grace watched him go, a mixture of gratitude and determination filling the space where despair had been. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The note became Grace's lifeline. Each night after putting her daughter to bed, she would pull it from her apron pocket and read it again under the dim kitchen light. The words etched in neat handwriting reminded her that she wasn't just a waitress fumbling through life but a mother and a fighter, someone who mattered. Despite the jeers from customers, her boss's derision, and the weight of her exhaustion, the note whispered a truth she had long forgotten. She was capable of more. One day, after yet another grueling double shift where her boss sneered at her for spilling a drink and a patron muttered under their breath about lazy help, Grace sat alone in the park near her apartment, the note clutched in her hand. She watched mothers chase their children in the fading light and realized that her daughter deserved a better version of her, a mother who wasn't constantly tired, broken, and humiliated. That night, she searched the internet for resources, her heart pounding with both hope and doubt. After an hour of digging through local websites, she found an organization that offered childcare assistance and educational programs for struggling single parents. Grace hesitated before dialing the number. The woman on the other end of the line spoke gently, her voice warm with understanding. "You're not alone in this," she said. "We can help you." For the first time in months, Grace cried, her tears hot and silent as the woman explained the process. By the end of the call, Grace had an appointment to visit their office. The next week, after dropping her daughter off at the daycare provided by the organization, Grace sat in a small office with a caseworker named Linda. She explained her situation, how she worked endless hours at the cafe, struggled to pay rent, and had dreams she'd long since buried. Linda nodded, her gaze kind but firm. "It's not going to be easy, Grace. But you're here, and that's the first step. Let's talk about what you want for yourself and your daughter." Grace hesitated, her voice trembling as she said, "I want to go back to school. I never finished my degree and I want to be someone my daughter can look up to." That evening, Grace enrolled in evening classes for business administration at the local community college. The transformation wasn't immediate. Her days remained exhausting, working 2 shifts at the cafe and rushing to class in the evenings. But now, there was a purpose behind her exhaustion. Not everyone around her was supportive. At work, her boss grew even more dismissive when she mentioned her classes. "Evening classes?" He scoffed one day when she requested to swap a late shift. "You think you're too good for this place now?" "No," Grace said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I need to do this for my daughter." He laughed coldly. "Let me give you a reality check, Grace. People like you don't get out of places like this. You'll be back here in a year, begging for hours." Her co-workers weren't much better. Some snickered behind her back, mocking her ambition. One, a sharp-tongued woman named Mandy, openly jeered. "Evening classes? What's next, running for president? You'll be working here forever, honey. Accept it?" But Grace held onto the note, folding and unfolding it in her pocket like a ritual. The words were her armor against the doubt and the ridicule. The group of young men who had tormented her in the cafe made their return a few weeks later. The leader smirked as he saw her, leaning across his table. "Hey Grace, how's the big shot life going? Still cleaning up spilled coffee?" She ignored him, her focus unwavering as she carried a tray to another table. The leader, not satisfied with her silence, muttered to his friends, "Bet she thinks she's some kind of hero now." taking classes at night? Please. She probably can't even spell degree. Laughter erupted from their table, but this time, Grace didn't flinch. She straightened her back, her steps steady. As the weeks turned into months, her determination began to pay off. The organization helped her secure partial tuition funding, and she was excelling in her classes. She found herself growing in confidence, her voice stronger and her shoulders less hunched. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift where her boss had berated her in front of a full cafe, she arrived at class late. She apologized profusely to her professor, who simply smiled and said, "You're here. That's what matters." The man from the cafe, though absent, lingered in her thoughts. She often wondered if he had any idea of the impact his small gesture had made. She kept the note on her nightstand now, no longer afraid it would be crumpled or lost. But not everyone was happy with Grace's newfound resolve. Her boss's comments grew harsher, and he began assigning her the least favorable shifts. "If you're too tired to work," he'd say with a sneer, "maybe you should quit those useless classes." One day, Grace overheard him speaking to a regular customer, an older man who often left generous tips. "She's wasting her time," her boss said, loud enough for Grace to hear. "People like her don't change. They don't get out." The humiliation stung, but instead of breaking her, it fueled her resolve. That night, Grace wrote a new note for herself, placing it beside the one the man had left. "You're proving them wrong every day. Keep going." Grace didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to find out. It was a cold, overcast afternoon when the man walked into the cafe again, seeking refuge from the biting wind outside. He hadn't planned to stop there. It was a coincidence, really, but something about the familiar ambience and the memory of the young waitress drew him in. As the door swung shut behind him, he glanced around the cafe, taking in the scattered patrons and soft murmur of conversation. Then he saw her. At first, he wasn't sure it was the same woman. Grace, the waitress who had seemed so fragile and defeated, now moved through the cafe with a sense of purpose. Her posture was straight, her steps confident. She carried trays with ease, her smile genuine as she greeted customers. There was a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Intrigued, the man found a seat near the counter and waited for her to notice him. When she finally approached, recognition flickered across her face. "Hi," she said, her voice warm but tinged with surprise. "I remember you." The man smiled, nodding. "And I remember you. You look different. Happier." Grace's cheeks flushed slightly, and she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I suppose I am," she admitted. "A lot has changed since you were last here." He tilted his head, curiosity piqued. "Care to share?" For a moment, Grace hesitated, glancing around the cafe. The familiar clinking of cups and hum of conversation provided a backdrop of normalcy, but this moment felt anything but ordinary. Finally, she leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. "Do you remember the note you left me?" she asked, her hand instinctively brushing her apron pocket, where she had carried it for months. The man nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I do. Did it help?" Grace's eyes shimmered as she nodded. "It was more than just help. That note, it gave me hope when I didn't have any left. It reminded me that even small steps matter." She took a deep breath, the words spilling out like a confession. "I used to think I was trapped, that this job, this life, was all I'd ever have. But after I read your note, I realized I couldn't keep living like that. I started looking for help. I found a local organization that offered childcare assistance, and they helped me enroll in evening classes. I'm working toward a business degree now." The man's smile grew, pride evident in his expression. "That's incredible, Grace. You've come a long way." She nodded, her smile widening. "It hasn't been easy. My boss, well, let's just say he's not exactly thrilled about me trying to improve myself. He's made things harder whenever he can. And some customers." She glanced toward a table in the corner where a familiar group of young men sat, laughing loudly. The man's gaze followed hers, and his face darkened as he recognized the group that had mocked her before. The leader, the same smug young man, was leaning back in his chair, gesturing animatedly to his friends. "They're still at it?" he asked, his voice low. Grace shrugged, her expression calm but resolute. They try. But they don't bother me as much anymore. I know who I am now. And I know I'm better than the things they say. Before the man could respond, the group's leader noticed Grace and smirked. Hey, look who's all smiles today, he called out, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. What's the occasion, Grace? Finally win Employee of the Month. His friends burst into laughter, and Grace stiffened slightly, the tension flickering across her face for only a moment. She turned to the man and whispered, "Excuse me." The man watched as Grace approached their table, her steps steady and her head held high. "Is there something you need?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The leader leaned forward, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, Grace, we need more coffee. And maybe a little attitude adjustment while you're at it. You're getting too big for your apron." More laughter followed, but this time, Grace didn't falter. "I'll bring your coffee," she said simply. "But if you have a problem with me, maybe you should take it up with someone else." The leader's grin faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "What's that supposed to mean?" Grace met his gaze, unflinching. "It means I'm not here to be your punching bag. You don't like me? Fine. But I'm not going to let you ruin my day." The man at the counter couldn't help but smile as he watched the exchange. Grace's words, while calm, carried a weight that silenced the group. The leader muttered something under his breath, but the fight had drained from his posture. When Grace returned to the counter, she exhaled deeply, a small, triumphant smile playing at her lips. "They're not so scary once you stand up to them," she said quietly. The man nodded, his admiration clear. "You've changed, Grace. You're stronger than I think even you realize." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I think I always had it in me," she admitted. "But sometimes, you just need someone to remind you." As she spoke, the cafe door opened, and her boss strode in, his eyes immediately scanning the room. He spotted Grace at the counter and frowned. "Grace, break time's over. Table 7's waiting." Grace straightened, but this time, there was no fear in her posture. She glanced at the man and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly before heading back to work. The man watched her go, a sense of pride and hope swelling in his chest. Grace was no longer the defeated young woman he had met months ago. She was carving out a new path, one small step at a time, and nothing, not cruel customers, not a bitter boss, could take that from her. Several months passed, and life carried on for the man as usual. Work, family, and daily routines blurred together, though his thoughts occasionally drifted back to the young waitress and her quiet determination. One evening, as he sifted through his mail, a hand-addressed envelope caught his eye. Curious, he opened it and was immediately struck by its contents. Inside was a letter from Grace. She thanked him for his kindness and recounted how his simple note had sparked a chain of events that changed her life. She had completed her first semester of classes, continued to grow in confidence, and with the help of the organization that had supported her, she had secured funding to open a family support center in the community. The center was designed to help parents like her, those struggling to balance work, childcare, and personal growth, with practical resources and a safe place for their children. Grace had included an invitation to the opening ceremony. The man sat back, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He felt a surge of pride and disbelief. What he had seen as a small gesture, a note scribbled in a moment of empathy, had blossomed into something monumental. Without hesitation, he marked the date on his calendar. The day of the opening ceremony arrived, and the man found himself outside a modest yet welcoming building in the heart of the community. A banner strung across the entrance read, "New Horizons Family Support Center, Opening Day." The front steps were crowded with people, parents with children, local leaders, and volunteers. As he stepped closer, he saw Grace standing by the entrance, greeting guests with a smile that radiated confidence and pride. She spotted him immediately, her eyes lighting up. "You came," she exclaimed, rushing over to shake his hand. "Of course," he said, smiling. "How could I not? This is incredible, Grace." She blushed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's thanks to you. That note you left, it changed everything." Before he could respond, a voice called out, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Grace led him inside, where rows of chairs had been set up. At the front of the room was a small stage with a microphone. Posters on the walls highlighted the center's mission: affordable childcare, parenting workshops, and job placement programs. When everyone was seated, Grace stepped onto the stage. She adjusted the microphone, her hands steady despite the crowd's attention. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice clear and strong. "This center is more than just a building. It's a place where families can find support, where parents like me can feel less alone in their struggles." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on the man. "I want to share a story about how one small act of kindness can create ripples far beyond what anyone might imagine." Grace recounted the day she met the man, the note he left her, and how it became a source of hope when she felt utterly lost. She spoke of the challenges she had faced: the dismissive boss, the cruel customers, and the weight of balancing work and motherhood. "But that note," she said, pulling it from her pocket and holding it up, "reminded me that I wasn't invisible. It reminded me that small steps matter, even when they feel impossible." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. She continued, her voice steady. "That small gesture gave me the courage to ask for help, to believe that I could build something better for myself and my daughter. And now, because of that kindness, we're here today, opening a center that will do the same for others." Applause erupted, and the man felt his throat tighten. He hadn't realized just how much of an impact his words had made until now. Over the following months, the center became a hub of activity. Parents from all walks of life came through its doors, finding resources and connections that had previously seemed out of reach. Grace, once a waitress struggling to make ends meet, emerged as a community leader. Her confidence and determination inspired others, and she was often invited to speak at local events. The man, deeply moved by the experience, began to look at his own life differently. He noticed opportunities to help others in small ways: a kind word to a stressed cashier, a listening ear for a struggling colleague, an extra tip for hardworking service staff. Each time, he thought of Grace and the power of small gestures. One afternoon, he returned to the cafe where it all began. The familiar smells and sounds greeted him as he stepped inside. To his surprise, Grace wasn't there, her absence a testament to how far she had come. Instead, a young waitress with the same overwhelmed expression he had once seen in Grace moved through the cafe. When she approached his table, fumbling slightly with her tray, the man offered her a warm smile. "You're doing great," he said softly, leaving a generous tip and, this time, another note. "Sometimes, all it takes is a little kindness. Keep going, you're stronger than you think." As he left the cafe, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that Grace's story had come full circle, and now he could pass that kindness on to someone else. Back at the center, Grace continued to thrive. She expanded its programs, organized fundraisers, and became a symbol of hope for the community. The group of young men who had once mocked her at the cafe faded into irrelevance, their cruelty a mere footnote in her story. Even her former boss, who had scoffed at her dreams, was forced to confront her success when a local newspaper featured her story on the front page. The man and Grace remained in touch, their unlikely connection a reminder to both of the extraordinary impact ordinary people can have on each other. And though life would always present challenges, Grace faced them head-on, knowing she was no longer the woman who once felt invisible in a crowded cafe. She was a leader, a role model, and proof that even the smallest acts of kindness can change the world.